G'day there, Ray Corcoran here. In this week's video, we're going to be going over, is Australia going into a recession? What is a recession? How long do they last? What does it actually mean for you day to day? Does the US going into recession mean that it automatically happens here? And also some of my tips for navigating a recession and sort of slower times in the economy. There's been a lot of talk in the media about a recession potentially being on the horizon. The States are probably going to go into recession, sometimes, very, very soon, I think. But a lot of people are quite worried about it. They're not sure how they're going to manage their budget and what that means for them cost-wise and, what's the go with inflation. And there's a lot of things kind of creating a lot of uncertainty in the world. So in this video, I just want to talk about recessions specifically and what you can do to navigate them successfully. So firstly, what is a recession? So there's no single agreed definition for one, but basically at a high level, it means that the economic output of a country or region is not as good as they'd like it to be. It usually means that it's either growing really, really slowly or it's going negative. And that's just a period where it's not going very well. Typically, we expect, the GDP or gross domestic product of a country or region generally to creep up over time. And when it's not doing that, we typically will call it a recession. Now, in the media, you may see them refer to what's known as a technical recession. And that's basically when there are 2 consecutive quarters, so 6 months, where real GDP growth is negative. Now, the real part just means that it's adjusted for inflation. And what that means is that there's been 6 months where the total, GDP is basically the total output of goods and services for a country or region, all added up. And if that number is going backwards over a 6-month period, then they are in what's known as a technical recession. Now, the Reserve Bank of Australia, who oversees the stability of the financial system in Australia, they aren't the biggest fan of this definition because it is quite oversimplified. You can have a situation where you don't have a technical recession, but the economy is still not in a good shape. So you might have 1 quarter, so 3 months, where there is negative GDP growth, but then the next month might be only just positive by 0.1%. And you can have high unemployment and all that sort of stuff. So you can have a situation where the economy is not really doing that well, but by that definition, you wouldn't call it a technical recession. And in Australia anyways, over the last 30 years or so, having 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth is actually quite rare. You may have the odd single quarter, but having 2 of them back to back is actually quite rare. And I'll put a graph on screen now kind of showing the last sort of 30 years or so, excluding the most recent couple of years. But you can kind of see that it doesn't happen very, very often. So what actually causes a recession? So there's a number of factors that can cause it. One of the first ones is a sudden economic shock. And that could be something like COVID in 2020. It feels like last year, but it's actually a couple of years ago now when it started. But basically something that is a real sudden shock that can really disrupt global economies, and people are not selling as much stuff as they were, and then the stuff just generally starts to get worse. Another reason is when there's excessive debt carried by businesses or individuals. So anytime where there's huge amounts of debt, that can also be a pretty dangerous thing. The third one is asset bubbles. So anytime you have assets, it could be stocks, property, crypto, trading cards, whatever it is, if the prices of those assets start to get quite ridiculous and totally way away from reality, that can be quite concerning, and it can be a sign that potentially a correction is on the horizon. And other reasons include times where there's really high inflation, like we're starting to see in Australia and definitely happening in America, and also supply chain disruptions. So the stuff that we're seeing right now as well, like all the supply chain issues in China and pretty much worldwide at the moment, that's causing big problems because, if supply chains collapse or they're paused, like we've seen in Shanghai a few weeks back, it was closed for about 6 to 8 weeks. Goods can't be created. And if goods can't be created, they can't be sold, people can't make money. And the cycle of money doesn't, it's not cycling around the economy like it should be. In terms of what actually happens during a recession, once we're in a recession, some of the things that you might notice, I guess, on the ground is you may not get a pay rise that you were probably expecting. You may not be able to negotiate your salary as easy as before because companies are a bit more conscious of spending money. You might not, you may get fired from your job, in a bad situation. The value of your house or your stocks or assets can go down. If you're a business owner like myself, you may notice that some people take longer to make a decision about buying, or they may be more competitive on price, or they may be less keen to buy generally. You also might notice that spending will shift from away from luxury goods towards essential goods and services, because people are starting to tighten their belts. There's less cash flying around in the economy, but also in their personal world. So they're not as keen to go maybe splash out on lavish things temporarily. Businesses might not be hiring as much. Individual confidence and business confidence may be lower. So people aren't as maybe ambitious or as confident to make the moves that they would have been making maybe a year or a few years ago, because they're not sure whether they're going to make all this investment in their business and then the sales won't be able to support that. And they might be caught in a situation where they don't have any money left over. And also sometimes you can see higher interest rates as well. In terms of whether the US going into recession will affect Australia, there is a classic phrase, when America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. Because they have the biggest GDP of any country in the world, typically they're so interconnected with every other country that if things go bad there, it usually flows on everywhere else. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Australia always goes into recession. There are a couple of examples when the US was in recession and it did not flow across to Australia, like the early 2000s and the 2008 GFC. So just because bad things happen there doesn't always mean that it will flow on to Australia. Whether it happens next year when a lot of people expect America to go into recession remains to be seen, but just know that they are not always directly correlated. Goldman Sachs is actually predicting a 35% chance of America going into recession in the next 2 years, as well as 3/4 of Fortune 500 CEOs are expecting America to go into recession in 2023. Coming back to Australia now, the thing that will affect Australia's ability to avoid recession this time, there's going to be a few different factors. So the government has kind of emptied the bank account to give so much stimulus in 2020 and 2021. So that's kind of one less tool that they have to give more stimulus should Australia be approaching recession in 2023. They're not going to have as much money as they did because they already gave out heaps, but they kind of had to do that during 2020. Nobody really knew how bad it was going to be. It sounds like they kind of overspent by quite a bit, but in the heat of the moment, I'm not sure I can really blame them for taking drastic action. You kind of hamstrung a little bit there. In terms of good things, unemployment is at its lowest rate in 48 years, so that's 3.9%. That is a good thing for the economy. In terms of bad things, interest rates are already extremely low, so that's kind of why a lot of people are suspecting the RBA is increasing interest rates, because if they keep interest rates super, super low and then the recession hits, where are they going to go from there? Into negative interest rates? It kind of backs them into a corner. So I can kind of understand that they want to increase rates to really scare people and shock people. And then hopefully that will give them some fat to trim in 2023, which is something they have indicated in some of their monthly reports. So how long do recessions typically last? So in the States, the National Bureau of Economic Research did a study from 1945 to 2009, and they found that the average recession was about 11 months. In 2020, they found that the recession was relatively short, only really lasted about 3 months or so, but on the longer end, they can last up to, say, 18 months or so. The good news about recessions, though, is typically recessions are short relative to the period of growth that usually follows. So I'll put a graph on screen now, and you can actually see, even if there's a little bit of a dip, there's a much longer period of growth following that typically. So while it's not fun in the moment with a recession, typically the period of growth that you'll experience after is significantly better. And I guess it's a lesson to everybody when it comes to your personal finances. Yes, there's going to be downtimes and recessions and that sort of stuff, but you've also got to make the most of the good times. So if you feel like if the economy isn't in recession, you've got to go hard then and make sure you make the most money and build as much wealth as possible so that when a slowdown comes, it doesn't really bother you. So now we know everything about a recession, or at least a little bit. What do we actually do about it? So in terms of my tips for navigating a recession, the first thing is increase your savings buffer. And there's not financial advice, of course. I'm not qualified at all to give you this advice. Basically, build up your buffer. So for me personally, I've typically actually not really kept much of a buffer in place. My expenses were low, not a big deal. ever since I got my family home a few months ago, my expenses each month are obviously they've jumped up a bit. So for me, I am keeping a much larger buffer than I have needed to in the past. And I don't mind, that's just, the way it is. A lot of people will keep, 3 to 6 months buffer is a good starting point. For me, I'm looking to keep about a 12-month buffer. I think that's overkill, but for me, I like peace of mind factor and I don't mind having it not utilized and just having it sitting there. And also, I guess it depends on your personal situation. So for me, we might be having a second kid on the horizon. If we decide to go that route, then there's a recession. I want to have extra money on hand. So you need to factor it in for your own personal situation. If you don't expect to have a lot of big expenses coming up, then you may be more comfortable having less there, and that's fine. For me, I'll probably keep a little bit extra because of my situation. So just obviously keep that in mind. Second is review all your costs one by one, both individual and if you have a business as well. So you want to go through your costs, go through anything that's not adding value and get rid of it. One thing I would say to people, especially business owners, or just generally, I guess, is don't be so defensive minded during a recession or the lead up to a potential recession. It may not even materialize. A lot of people get so scared and shrink when they should be growing. They should be going on the offense and making the most of the situation. I'll probably do another separate video on navigating a recession, but I think a lot of people, they get really scared, they cut all their expenses and they actually stop doing a lot of the things that help them grow their career or grow their business. I really am against that. I think a lot of people make a big mistake there and they cut all their expenses. I see people doing less, in their business, less marketing. They should be doing more marketing. And maybe check the numbers closer, but some of these people are going it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They create their own mini recession because they're so scared and fearful that they don't make the moves that they need to make. So keep that in mind, cut your expenses, be diligent with that side, but also don't, hide in a box and just wait for it to be over. I think that's a terrible approach. The next tip is make the decisions earlier rather than later. If you cut your expenses now and you're pretty ruthless about it, that's probably going to be a little bit safer than you kind of seeing how it goes over 6 months or 12 months and then being like, crap, I actually really need to cut really dramatic. You might need to cut twice as much down the road. Start acting as if it's going to happen and build up your buffer, cut your expenses, go hard. For me personally, I feel like I'm going to be working extra in the lead up to this so that I'm in a really strong position regardless of what happens. I don't want to be worried by some recession. I want to go into it feeling confident that all my ducks are in a row. I'm in the strongest position I can be in. And then whatever bumps happen, they happen. And then, it's not a big deal to me. Which leads me to my next point, which is start increasing your income. So I always go on about this, but look at side hustles. If you have a business, how can you increase revenue and profit? Look at other ways, is it try and get a pay rise? Some people, you might be able to get a pay rise in before your company or employer notices that maybe things are going to slow down. Whatever it is, try and make more money. The extra money that you have lying around, the better, the more you'll be able to sleep at night during any downturn. The next tip is increasing your skill set. So obviously that's linked to increasing your income, but just generally, don't waste this time doing nothing and just being worried about everything every day. Be proactive, start building your skill set, make yourself more valuable. Valuable staff members in any business very rarely get cut. They're the last ones to be cut. So if you're someone that's sort of middle level or low level in your company, then start looking at how can I be a high value person? Even if you're on an entry level role, how can I be the best in my department or my division? And then that way, if things go bad, either A, you stay in that you're the last one to be cut, or B, if you do get cut and you're very valuable, you'll find it easy to get a job because you have those skills and confidence and all that sort of stuff. And the next tip is don't watch the news. So during all this time, the media is going to be trying to get you scared and worried about all this, and you're going to spend all this time on social media seeing all these scary videos and all this sort of stuff. Just tune out. Same as in 2020, I was saying, don't watch the news, dial down that sort of stuff. It doesn't add value to your life. It will just fog up your brain and you won't be able to focus on the practical stuff day to day that will help you navigate it very successfully. There's going to be a lot of people that build a lot of wealth over the next couple of years. Make sure you're one of them. Dial down the social media and dial up your own inputs. And that's going to mean that during this time, a lot of people are going to get slowed down and stuck in the mud, and you're going to cruise past because you're the one that has been doing the inputs needed to build your wealth and move forward. And the final thought I'll leave you with is this. It's a quote from Ayrton Senna, who was a Formula One driver back in the day. He said that you cannot overtake 15 cars in sunny weather, but you can when it's raining. And I saw this on LinkedIn, someone reposted it. I thought it was such a fantastic quote and very relevant to the recession, or a potential recession. When things are really, really good, it's hard to sort of get past people. When things are chaotic, that is one of the best times for you to move ahead, potentially leapfrog someone in your organization if you're in a corporate role, or if you're in a business. It's a really good time to catch up to competitors or get ahead of the number one in your market. So use the time to your advantage, and I think you'll do really, really well. Meanwhile, a lot of people will probably be, struggling and stressed out and that sort of stuff. So I hope you found that useful. I really appreciate it if you give it a like, helps it sort of reach more people. And if you want to subscribe. We're almost at 2K subs, which I'm very excited about, and hopefully 10K by the end of the year, just quietly. But I hope you found that useful, and I'll see you on the next video.